Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You know that feeling when you discover something you were never meant to find? That's what happened to me when I stumbled upon a hidden safe in my parents' house. At first, I thought it might hold some old family treasures or documents, but what I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about my life. It began on an unremarkable Saturday afternoon. My parents had asked for help clearing out the attic, a task they'd been putting off for years. They were getting ready to downsize into a smaller home, and the attic was a dusty treasure trove of old photo albums, forgotten toys, and boxes stuffed with who knew what. The stale smell of aged paper filled the air as we worked our way through the mess. At first, I wasn't particularly interested in the job. I'd been roped into it mostly out of guilt after dodging their previous requests for help. But as I moved a few boxes and started to uncover more of the attic's hidden corners, something caught my eye. Tucked into the far end of the space, behind an old steamer trunk, was a metal panel set into the floor. It didn't seem to match the rest of the attic. While the surrounding boards were worn and splintered, this panel was solid and smooth, almost as if it didn't belong. Curiosity got the better of me. I cleared away the dust and pried at the edges of the panel until I could lift it, revealing what looked like a small, built-in safe. It was old, with rust creeping along the corners and a combination lock that was stiff to the touch. I stared at it for a moment, wondering how long it had been there and why no one had ever mentioned it. "Hey, Dad," I called out, trying to keep my voice casual. He appeared a few moments later, a cardboard box in his hands. "What's up? What's this?" I asked, pointing to the safe. His reaction was immediate and startling. His face went pale, and his hands tightened around the box he was holding. For a moment, he just stared at the safe, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. Then he cleared his throat and muttered, "Oh, it's nothing, just some old junk." I frowned. "Really? It doesn't look like nothing. What's inside?" "Nothing important," he said quickly, setting the box down and brushing his hands off. "Just leave it. We don't need to mess with it right now." His tone was firm, and before I could press further, he changed the subject, asking if I'd found any old photo albums yet. The abrupt shift left me unsettled, but I didn't push him. At least, not then. Later that evening, after my parents had gone to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the safe. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with possibilities. Why had my dad reacted so strangely? If it was really just junk, why was he so eager to dismiss it? And why hadn't I ever noticed it before? By midnight, my curiosity had reached a breaking point. I crept back up to the attic with a flashlight, careful not to make too much noise. The safe was still there, of course, its combination lock gleaming faintly in the dim light. I ran my fingers over it, trying to imagine what could be inside. I knew I couldn't open it without the combination, but that didn't stop me from trying. I spun the dial, guessing at random numbers, birthdays, anniversaries, anything that might mean something to my parents. Nothing worked. Frustrated, I sat back on my heels, staring at the safe as if it might reveal its secrets on its own. It was obvious I wasn't going to crack it that night, but one thing was clear. I wasn't going to let this go. Whatever my parents were hiding in that safe, I was determined to find out. Little did I know, what I was about to uncover would change everything I thought I knew about my family and about myself. The next morning, the safe was the only thing on my mind. I couldn't look at my dad the same way. Over breakfast, I watched him from across the table, trying to read his expression for any sign that he was hiding something. But he was calm, laughing at the newspaper comics like it was any other morning. Meanwhile, my curiosity was eating me alive. I knew asking him for the combination outright wasn't an option. He'd either shut me down or get suspicious, and I wasn't ready to have that confrontation just yet. So, I decided to try my luck with the obvious choices. After my parents left the house to run errands, I climbed back into the attic armed with nothing but determination. I crouched in front of the safe and spun the combination lock, trying every important date I could think of. My dad's birthday, my mom's birthday, their anniversary. I even tried my own birthday, but none of them worked. Frustration bubbled up as I stared at the unyielding lock. I leaned back, running a hand through my hair. If the combination wasn't a date, then what could it be? My dad wasn't exactly the sentimental type, so it wasn't like he'd choose something random just for fun. That's when I remembered the notebook. My dad used to keep an old spiral-bound notebook for jotting down work notes, random reminders, and everything in between. I'd seen it a few days ago in one of the boxes we'd pulled out of the attic. It had been shoved in with some old tools, forgotten and dusty. I rummaged through the boxes until I found it. The cover was worn and smudged with grease stains, but the pages inside were intact. Flipping through it, I saw a mix of scribbled work notes, measurements, and doodles. Then, on one page near the back, something caught my eye. In the margins, there were numbers written in no particular order. They didn't seem to correspond to anything, no dates or addresses that I recognized. But there was something about the way they were grouped, almost like they had been jotted down deliberately. I had a gut feeling these numbers were important. I climbed back to the safe, notebook in hand. My heart pounded as I turned the dial, carefully matching the numbers from the page. For a moment, nothing happened, and I braced myself for another dead end. But then I heard a soft click. I froze, hardly daring to believe it. Slowly, I pulled the safe door open. The space inside was small and surprisingly empty. No cash, no glittering jewels. Instead, there was a neat stack of papers, a faded manila folder, and a yellowed envelope that looked like it had been handled dozens of times. My pulse quickened. I reached for the envelope first, feeling the brittle paper crackle under my fingers. There was no writing on the outside, and I hesitated for a moment before opening it. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of my parents, but they weren't alone. Standing with them was a man I didn't recognize. He looked about my dad's age, with a warm smile and a casual arm draped around my mom's shoulders. The three of them were standing in front of what looked like an old cabin, and the date on the back of the photo read, June 1995. My stomach churned. Who was this man, and why was this photo locked away in a safe? I set the photo aside and reached for the stack of papers. The top one was a handwritten letter. The first line stopped me cold. To my name. If you're reading this, there's something you need to know. I stared at the letter, my mind racing. Who wrote this? What could possibly be important enough to hide it in a safe? I looked at the faded handwriting and noticed the signature at the bottom. It wasn't my dad's handwriting. The name signed at the bottom was Michael. I didn't know anyone named Michael. At least, I didn't think I did. My hands trembled as I flipped through the rest of the papers. There were legal documents, forms that looked official, with seals and signatures. And there it was again, the name Michael appearing next to my own name on some of the papers. I didn't understand what I was looking at, but I knew one thing for certain. This safe wasn't just holding some forgotten junk. It was hiding a secret. And whatever that secret was, it had something to do with me. That realization sent a shiver down my spine. I needed answers, but I wasn't sure I was ready for what I might find. The contents of the safe were deceptively simple, just a handful of items that didn't look particularly remarkable at first glance. But as I sat there on the dusty attic floor, staring at them, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just unearthed something significant. I picked up the photo first. It was old, the colors slightly faded, but the faces were clear. My parents stood side by side, smiling at the camera, but it was the man standing next to them who caught my attention. He was about my dad's age, with dark hair and an easy smile. His arm was casually draped around my mom's shoulders, and they all looked so comfortable together. Something about the way they stood felt off. Intimate. Like he wasn't just some friend or coworker. I flipped the photo over, and there it was. A name scribbled on the back in faded ink. Michael, 1995. The date stopped me cold. 1995. That was only 2 years before I was born. I tried to remember if I'd ever heard of a Michael in connection to my parents, but the name didn't ring any bells. Whoever he was, they'd never talked about him. Not to me, at least. My pulse quickened as I reached for the letter. It was folded neatly, the paper slightly yellowed with age. My hands trembled as I opened it and began to read. Dear Rebecca, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been thinking a lot about the decision we made, and I just want to say that I trust you and Tom to do what's best. I know this isn't easy for any of us, but I truly believe it's the right choice. I hope this decision will give him my name, the life he deserves. Please know that I'm not stepping back because I don't care. It's the opposite. I care too much. I want him to have stability, and I know you can give him that. If he ever asks about me, tell him the truth when the time is right. All my best. Michael. I reread the letter 3 times, my mind spinning with questions. The way Michael talked about stepping back and the decision we made left no room for doubt. This wasn't just a friendly connection. This was about me. I felt like I couldn't breathe. Who was Michael? Why was he writing about me like that? And why had my parents hidden this letter away in a safe for all these years? Desperate for answers, I turned to the manila folder. It was heavier than I expected, stuffed with papers that were neatly arranged but clearly old. My hands shook as I opened it. The first thing I saw was a legal document with the words adoption agreement printed at the top in bold letters. My name jumped out at me immediately, followed by my parents' names. But what caught my attention was the section marked biological father. Michael's name was there, written in clean, official handwriting. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Adoption agreement? Biological father? Was this saying what I thought it was saying? My parents had never mentioned anything about adoption. As far as I knew, they were my biological parents. 1,000 questions flooded my mind, each one louder than the last. Did my dad know about this? Did my mom? How could they have kept this from me for so long? And if Michael was my biological father, why wasn't he part of my life? I sat there in stunned silence, the papers spread out around me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't know how to solve. The photo, the letter, the documents, they were all pointing to one undeniable truth. My parents had been hiding something major from me. But why? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? I knew I couldn't ignore this. Whatever the truth was, I had to find it. And the first step was confronting my parents. The letter and the adoption papers consumed my thoughts. I couldn't shake the image of Michael's name, neatly typed under biological father, or the way he had written about stepping back for my sake. Each word seemed to echo in my mind, growing louder with every passing hour. I kept going through the folder, hoping for more clarity, but the documents only raised more questions. The adoption agreement seemed straightforward enough, a legal formality ensuring my parents' custody of me. But why hadn't they ever told me I was adopted? Why hide it for so long? The more I thought about it, the angrier I became. My parents had always been upfront about everything, or so I'd thought. But this was a lie, a life-altering secret they deliberately kept from me. And Michael? Who was he? Why had he disappeared from my life, leaving only this cryptic letter behind? That night, I couldn't pretend everything was normal. My parents were in the living room, watching a rerun of some crime drama. My dad had a bowl of popcorn balanced on his lap, while my mom sat with her knitting. They looked so ordinary, so normal, and it only made the weight of what I'd found feel heavier. I walked into the room, holding the photo and the letter. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My mom glanced up, her smile fading the moment she saw what I was holding. My dad froze mid-chew, his eyes darting between me and the papers in my hand. "What's this?" I asked, holding up the photo. "Who is Michael?" My mom's face went pale, and her knitting fell from her hands. She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like she was struggling to find the right words. My dad, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to sink into the couch and disappear. "Where did you get that?" my mom finally managed to say. "It doesn't matter," I shot back. "I want to know the truth. Who is Michael, and why is his name on an adoption agreement with mine?" For a moment, the only sound in the room was the muffled noise of the TV. Then my mom let out a shaky breath and said, "We were going to tell you. We just didn't know when, or how." "Tell me what?" I demanded, my voice rising. "That I'm adopted? That everything I thought I knew about my life is a lie?" "It's not a lie," my dad said, finally speaking up. "We are your parents." "You're my parents legally," I said, holding up the adoption papers. "But biologically? That's a different story, isn't it?" My mom's eyes filled with tears, and she buried her face in her hands. My dad leaned forward, setting the popcorn bowl on the table, and rubbed his temples like he was trying to stave off a headache. "Michael is your biological father," my dad said quietly. "And your mom. Your mom is your biological mother." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I staggered back, staring at them in disbelief. "Wait, so you're my mom?" I asked, turning to her. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am." "Then what is all this?" I asked, gesturing to the letter and the papers. "Why would there be an adoption if you're my mom?" "It's complicated," my dad said, his voice strained. I folded my arms, glaring at him. "Uncomplicated for me." My mom sniffled and wiped her eyes. "Michael and I were together before I met your dad," she said. "We were young, and when I got pregnant with you, Michael, he wasn't ready to be a father. He said he couldn't handle it, that he didn't want the responsibility." She paused, her voice breaking, and my dad reached over to squeeze her hand. "When your dad and I got together," he stepped in. "He wanted to raise you as his own, and Michael agreed to sign away his parental rights. That's why there was an adoption agreement. It was a formality to make it official." I stared at her, my mind reeling. "So, you just decided not to tell me? You didn't think I had a right to know?" "We thought we were protecting you," my dad said. "We didn't want you to feel like you weren't part of this family. We didn't want you to feel different. Do you have any idea how I feel now?" I snapped. You lied to me for my entire life. You kept this huge part of who I am from me, and now I find out from some papers in a dusty old safe. We're sorry, my mom said, her voice shaking. We never meant to hurt you. We thought we were doing the right thing. I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. You had years to tell me. Years. And instead, you just, what? Hoped I'd never find out? We didn't think you'd find out this way, my dad admitted. But we always planned to tell you eventually. We just didn't know when the right time would be. There's no right time for something like this, I said. You just have to say it. I felt overwhelmed, a storm of emotions crashing over me. Anger, sadness, confusion. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, was suddenly in question. I needed answers, but I also needed space. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving my parents sitting in stunned silence. As I climbed the stairs to my room, one thought kept running through my mind. If Michael had wanted to step back from my life, why had he written that letter? And if my parents had kept this from me for so long, what else weren't they telling me? I didn't know what to believe anymore, but one thing was certain. I couldn't leave this unresolved. I had to find Michael. Only he could tell me the truth. After storming out of the living room, I sat in my room for what felt like hours, replaying everything my parents had just told me. My head was spinning. Michael wasn't just some name on a piece of paper or a figure in a photograph. He was my biological father. The words felt foreign and heavy, like they didn't belong to me. I couldn't stay angry forever, though. Anger only got me so far, and it wasn't answering my questions. Later that night, when the house had grown quiet, I heard a knock on my door. It was my dad. He hesitated in the doorway, looking older and more worn than I'd ever seen him. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice soft. I didn't say anything, just nodded. He came in and sat down on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together nervously. "I know this is a lot," he began, "and I know you're upset. You have every right to be, but I want you to understand why we did what we did." I stayed silent, waiting for him to continue. "Your mom and Michael, they were together for a couple of years before you were born," he said. "It was serious for a while, but when she got pregnant, everything changed. Michael wasn't ready for that kind of responsibility. He panicked." He paused, glancing at me to gauge my reaction, but I kept my face blank. "When your mom and I got together, you were just a baby. Michael had already decided to step away. He said he couldn't give you the stability you needed, and he wanted to give your mom the chance to build a life with someone who could. So, when your mom and I got married, we agreed to raise you as our own, and just pretend he didn't exist?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "It wasn't about pretending," my dad said, his voice heavy with regret. "It was about giving you a family. We didn't want you to feel like you were caught between two worlds. We thought it would be easier for you if you didn't know. But it wasn't your decision to make," I snapped. "You should have told me. I had a right to know." "I know," he said quietly. "We were going to tell you. We just didn't know how or when. And as the years went by, it got harder and harder to bring it up. We thought, why stir things up when everything seems fine?" "Fine," I said, my voice rising. "You call this fine? Finding out this way? From a letter in a safe?" He looked down at his hands, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, finally, he said, "You're right. We should have told you a long time ago. And I'm sorry we didn't." I wanted to scream, to shout that sorry wasn't enough. But the defeat in his voice, the genuine regret in his eyes, softened something inside me. When my mom joined us a few minutes later, her eyes were red and puffy from crying. She sat on the other side of the bed, clutching a tissue in her hands. "We thought we were doing the right thing," she said, her voice trembling. "We didn't want you to feel unwanted or confused. We wanted you to feel like you belonged." "Do you really think I wouldn't have felt like I belonged if I'd known the truth?" I asked. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know," she admitted. "We were scared. We were scared of what it would mean for you, for us, for our family." Her words hung heavy in the air. On one hand, I understood their fear. They'd made a decision out of love, even if it was the wrong one. But on the other hand, their choice had robbed me of the chance to know my own story. I sat there for a long time, not saying anything, just trying to process it all. My parents watched me nervously, as if waiting for me to explode. But I didn't. I was too drained, too overwhelmed. Finally, I said, "I need answers. And I don't think you can give me all of them." "What do you mean?" my mom asked. "I need to talk to Michael," I said. "I need to hear his side of the story." My parents exchanged a look, and for a moment, I thought they were going to argue. But then my dad nodded. Okay, he said. We'll help you find him. The next few days were a blur. My parents dug out an old address book, flipping through pages until they found an entry for Michael. They weren't sure if it was still accurate. It had been years since they'd last been in touch, but it was a starting point. I reached out cautiously, not sure what to expect. I sent a letter first, explaining who I was and what I had discovered. Writing it was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. How do you introduce yourself to someone who's supposed to be such a huge part of your life but feels like a stranger? A week later, I got a response. It was short and to the point. I've been waiting for this day. Let's talk. I read the message over and over, my heart racing. This was it. The answers I'd been searching for were finally within reach. But as much as I wanted to know the truth, I couldn't ignore the knot of fear in my stomach. What if I didn't like what I found? I wasn't sure if I was ready, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. After my parents gave me Michael's name and the few details they remembered about him, I threw myself into the search. I needed to find him, not just for answers but for closure. I had spent my entire life unknowingly tied to this man, and now I couldn't stop thinking about him. What kind of person was he? Why had he chosen to step away? And more importantly, did he regret it? It wasn't as simple as typing his name into a search engine. Michael Harris. His last name was common, and every search brought back hundreds of results. I sifted through countless profiles, scanning photos and biographies for anything that matched the image I had from the old photo in the safe. For days, I found nothing. Then, one evening, I hit what felt like the jackpot. I stumbled upon a social media profile belonging to a Michael Harris in his late 40s. The profile picture was of a man who looked strikingly similar to the one in the photo with my parents, only older. His hair was shorter now, streaked with gray at the temples, but his warm smile was unmistakable. My heart raced as I clicked through his profile. He lived a few states away, in a quiet suburban town. His posts were sporadic, but painted a picture of a man with a calm, steady life. There were photos of him hiking, laughing with friends, and standing next to a woman I assumed was his wife. In some pictures, he was holding a little girl, his daughter, maybe? Seeing those photos stirred something in me. He had built a family, a life. While I had grown up never knowing he existed, did his wife or daughter know about me? Had he ever thought about me over the years, or had I been a distant memory he'd left behind? I stared at the message box for hours, debating whether to reach out. I didn't want to disrupt his life or cause trouble for his family, but I also couldn't let this opportunity slip away. I had too many questions, and the answers were within reach. Finally, I started typing. Hi, Michael. My name is my name, and I believe you might be my biological father. I recently discovered some things about my past, and I was hoping we could talk. I hit send before I could second-guess myself again. The wait was agonizing. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, my heart leaped, only to sink when it wasn't him. I tried to distract myself, but nothing worked. All I could do was wonder what he would say, if he would respond at all. When the reply finally came, I almost didn't believe it. Hi, your name? I've been waiting for this day. I always wondered if you'd find me someday. I'd be happy to talk. Let me know how you'd like to do this. Michael. I read the message over and over, my emotions a chaotic mix of relief, nervousness, and something I couldn't quite name. He wasn't angry. He wasn't dismissive. If anything, his tone was warm, almost hopeful. I wrote back immediately, asking if he'd be willing to meet in person. To my surprise, he agreed without hesitation. He suggested a coffee shop halfway between his town and mine, a neutral place where we could talk without distractions. The days leading up to our meeting were some of the longest of my life. I replayed every possible scenario in my head, from awkward silences to emotional confrontations. What if he didn't have the answers I needed? What if meeting him made things more complicated instead of bringing clarity? When the day finally came, I arrived at the coffee shop early, my nerves making it impossible to sit still. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for him to walk in. Every time it opened, my heart jumped. Then, he walked in. I knew it was him the moment I saw him. He was taller than I expected, his posture confident but not intimidating. He looked around the room until our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Michael? I asked as he approached the table. He smiled, a nervous, tentative smile, and nodded. You must be your name, he said. We shook hands, the gesture feeling both formal and deeply personal. As we sat down, I couldn't help but study him. There were little things, his mannerisms, the way he furrowed his brow when he spoke, that felt oddly familiar. It was like seeing fragments of myself in someone else for the first time. The conversation started cautiously, both of us unsure how to navigate this uncharted territory. He told me about his life, how he had moved away after my mom got remarried, how he had tried to rebuild himself in the years that followed. I thought about you a lot, he admitted, his voice soft. I wondered how you were, what kind of person you'd become, but I didn't want to disrupt your life. Your mom and Tom, they gave you a stable home, and I didn't want to take that away from you. I listened, trying to absorb his words without letting my emotions overwhelm me. Why didn't you ever reach out? I asked. Why didn't you at least try? He hesitated, his gaze dropping to the table. I didn't think I had the right, he said finally. I gave up that right when I stepped back. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, but I thought it was the best thing for you. And then, as the years went on, it felt too late. Hearing his side didn't erase the hurt or the confusion, but it gave me a sense of understanding I hadn't expected. He wasn't some faceless figure who had abandoned me. He was a real person who had made a choice, flawed as it might have been, out of love and fear. By the end of the meeting, I still had questions, but I also felt a strange sense of relief. Meeting Michael didn't change who I was or undo the years of secrets, but it was a start. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I could finally piece together the parts of my story that had been missing for so long. The moment I saw Michael walk into the coffee shop, my chest tightened. It was surreal, like watching a ghost step into reality. He looked older than the photo I'd found in the safe. His hair thinner, streaked with gray, and faint lines etched into his face. But his eyes held the same warmth I'd noticed in the picture. For a moment, I felt like I couldn't move, the weight of what was about to happen rooting me to the chair. Then he spotted me. His eyes widened slightly, and a small, tentative smile tugged at his lips. I stood up awkwardly, unsure whether to shake his hand or hug him. He extended his hand first, and I took it, feeling the firm but gentle grip of a man who seemed just as unsure as I was. You must be your name, he said. And you must be Michael, I replied, my voice shakier than I'd intended. We sat down across from each other, the small table between us feeling like both a bridge and a barrier. For a moment, neither of us spoke, and I found myself studying him, looking for pieces of myself in the way he moved, the way he held his coffee cup. It was subtle, but it was there. The way he furrowed his brow when he was thinking, the slightly crooked smile. It felt like looking into a mirror that reflected not just the present, but a past I'd never known. I wasn't sure you'd want to meet me, Michael said finally, breaking the silence. When I got your message, I wasn't sure how you'd feel about everything. I wasn't sure either, I admitted. But I needed answers. He nodded, his expression solemn. I'll tell you anything you want to know. I didn't even know where to start. The questions that had been swirling in my mind for weeks now felt overwhelming. Finally, I settled on the one that had been haunting me the most. Why did you leave? I asked, my voice quiet but firm. Why didn't you stay in my life? Michael let out a long sigh, his gaze dropping to the table. I was 22 when your mom got pregnant, he began. We were young, and I thought we had all the time in the world. But when she told me she was expecting, it hit me like a freight train. I wasn't ready. I didn't have a steady job. I didn't know how to be a dad. I was terrified. He paused, running a hand through his hair. Your mom wanted to keep you. She was determined to give you the best life she could, and I admired her for that. But I knew I wasn't capable of being the father you deserved. So, when she started dating Tom, your dad, I stepped aside. He was steady, reliable, everything I wasn't. I thought you'd be better off without me complicating things. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, and I could see the weight of his decision etched into his face. It wasn't an easy choice, he said. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I thought I was doing what was best for you. I felt a lump rise in my throat. Hearing him say those words didn't make the hurt go away, but it gave me a new perspective. He hadn't left because he didn't care. He'd left because he cared too much, or at least that's what he believed at the time. Did you ever think about me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. All the time, he said without hesitation. Not a day went by that I didn't wonder about you. What you looked like, what kind of person you were growing up. I hoped you were happy. His honesty caught me off guard. I'd spent so long imagining him as a distant figure, someone who had walked away and never looked back. But the regret in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly as he spoke, it was clear he'd carried the weight of his decision for years. We talked for hours, the initial awkwardness giving way to a tentative connection. He told me stories about his childhood, about the dreams he'd had when he was younger and how life hadn't gone the way he'd planned. He told me about his work, his hobbies, and the family he'd built, a wife and a young daughter. I told them about you, he said. My wife knows, and so does my daughter, though she's still too young to understand. I didn't want to keep you a secret from them. I didn't think that would be fair. I nodded, unsure how to respond. It was strange to think that while I had been searching for him, he had already woven me into the fabric of his life in some way. At one point, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered photo. I kept this, he said, sliding it across the table. It was a picture of me as a baby, swaddled in a blanket, my tiny face scrunched up as I slept. My mom was holding me, smiling softly at the camera. Seeing it took my breath away. I didn't have much to hold on to, he said, but I kept this. It reminded me of what I gave up, and why I did it. I looked up at him, tears welling in my eyes. I wish you'd stayed, I said honestly. I know, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I wish I had, too. By the time we said goodbye, I felt like 1,000 emotions were swirling inside me. Sadness, gratitude, confusion, and even a strange sense of peace. Meeting Michael hadn't erased the years of questions or the pain of his absence, but it had given me something I hadn't realized I needed: understanding. As I walked back to my car, clutching the photo he'd given me, I realized this wasn't the end of my journey. It was just another step. A step toward piecing together the story of who I was and where I came from. For the first time, I felt like I was finally beginning to understand myself. After meeting Michael, I thought I'd feel a sense of resolution, like the puzzle pieces of my life would suddenly fall into place. But if anything, things felt more complicated than ever. Building a relationship with him was like stepping into uncharted territory, and with every step forward, I felt the weight of the past pulling me back. Michael and I began talking regularly after that first meeting. Sometimes it was over the phone, other times through long emails where he shared more about his life and asked about mine. He wanted to know everything: my childhood, my favorite memories, what kind of person I'd grown into. I could tell he was trying to make up for lost time, but part of me couldn't help but wonder, was it too late? At the same time, my feelings toward my parents grew more complicated. I still loved them, and I was grateful for the life they had given me, but the betrayal of their secrecy hung heavy between us. Every time I sat at the dinner table or heard them laugh at something on TV, I felt the weight of the lie they had carried for so many years. Why hadn't they trusted me with the truth? Why had they decided I wasn't strong enough to handle it? One night, I decided to bring it up again. My mom was in the kitchen, washing dishes, and my dad was sitting at the table with a crossword puzzle. I stood in the doorway, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. They both looked up, startled. My mom dried her hands on a dish towel, and my dad set his pencil down, glancing at her before answering. We thought we were protecting you, he said, his voice calm but tinged with regret. You keep saying that, I said, frustration bubbling up. But you weren't protecting me. You were protecting yourselves. You didn't trust me to handle the truth. My mom's eyes filled with tears, and she stepped closer. It wasn't about trust, she said. It was about love. We didn't want you to feel torn between two families. We wanted you to feel secure, like you belonged. But I do belong, I said. And I would have felt that even if I'd known about Michael. You didn't have to hide him to make me feel loved. They both looked at me, their expressions a mix of guilt and sorrow. We made a mistake, my dad admitted. We see that now, and we're sorry. Their apology was genuine, but it didn't erase the hurt. It was going to take time to rebuild the trust that had been shaken. Meanwhile, my relationship with Michael continued to grow, but it wasn't without its challenges. I struggled to figure out where he fit into my life. Was he just a part of my past, or did he have a place in my future? Should I treat him like a distant relative, someone I saw occasionally, or like the father he never got the chance to be? Michael was patient, never pushing me for more than I was ready to give. He shared stories about his life, his family, and his regrets, but he also respected my boundaries. I'm not here to replace anyone, he told me once. I just want to be a part of your life, however you'll let me. That sentiment comforted me, but it also left me feeling torn. I didn't want to hurt my parents by forging a close bond with Michael, but I also didn't want to deny myself the chance to get to know him. It felt like I was walking a tightrope, trying to balance the family I had always known with the new connections I was forming. One day, I confided in a close friend about everything that had happened. She listened patiently as I poured out my confusion and frustration, then said something that stuck with me. Family doesn't have to be an either-or thing, she said. It's not about choosing sides. It's about finding space for everyone in your life, even if it's messy. Her words stayed with me as I navigated the delicate balance of my relationships. Over time, I realized there wasn't a single, clear answer. Family didn't have to fit into neat categories. It could be messy and imperfect, filled with love and complicated emotions. There were moments when it felt overwhelming, when I wondered if I was doing the right thing by trying to bring Michael into my life while still holding on to my parents. But there were also moments of clarity, like when Michael shared a story about his struggles and I saw how much he cared, or when my mom hugged me after an argument and reminded me that she'd always be there for me. In the end, I realized that family isn't about perfection or even understanding everything. It's about showing up, being present, and allowing space for all the complicated, messy emotions that come with loving people. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but for the first time, I felt like I was starting to make peace with the tangled web of my past and my present. And in that, I found a new sense of belonging, one that didn't depend on clean lines or simple answers, but on the strength of the connections I chose to nurture. The night I decided to sit down with my parents felt heavier than any other conversation we'd had before. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth anymore. It was about confronting the lingering hurt and confusion that had been weighing on me ever since I discovered Michael's existence. I wasn't sure how they would react or if they were ready to hear everything I had to say, but I knew we couldn't move forward without addressing it. We sat at the kitchen table, the same one where countless family dinners and heart-to-hearts had taken place. But this time, the air was thick with unspoken tension. My dad fiddled with his wedding ring, and my mom folded her hands tightly on the table, her knuckles white. "I need to talk to you," I began, my voice steadier than I expected. "About everything. Michael, the adoption, the secrets." They both nodded, their expressions a mix of worry and sadness. My mom spoke first. "We've been waiting for this," she said softly. "We knew you'd want to talk eventually." I took a deep breath and began. I told them about how hurt I'd been to find out about Michael through a hidden safe instead of hearing it from them directly. I told them how betrayed I'd felt, how their decision to keep it a secret had made me question everything I thought I knew about our family. "You always told me honesty was important," I said, my voice trembling. "But you didn't trust me with the truth about my own life. Do you know how hard that is to process?" My mom's eyes filled with tears, and my dad's shoulders sagged as though the weight of their choices was finally catching up to them. "We were scared," my dad admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "Scared of what it would do to you, to us, to our family. We never wanted you to feel like you weren't loved or like you didn't belong," my mom added, her voice breaking. "You were, and are, everything to us. We thought we were protecting you." Their words didn't erase the pain, but I could see the sincerity in their eyes. For the first time, I truly understood that their choices, while flawed, had come from a place of love and fear. They hadn't wanted to hurt me. They'd wanted to shield me, even if it meant carrying the burden of their secret for years. "I know you love me," I said, my voice softer now. "And I love you, too. But you have to understand how hard this has been for me. I'm trying to make sense of who I am and where I come from, and it feels like the ground keeps shifting under me." "We're so sorry," my mom said, tears streaming down her face. "We know we made a mistake, and we'll do whatever it takes to rebuild the trust we've broken." My dad nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "We can't change the past, but we want to move forward with you. Whatever you need, we'll be here." It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was an honest one. For the first time, I felt like we were on the same page, not just as parents and child, but as people trying to navigate a difficult situation together. Over the weeks that followed, we began the slow process of rebuilding our trust. My parents stopped tiptoeing around the subject of Michael and started answering my questions openly, even when it was uncomfortable. They admitted their fears, their regrets, and the moments they'd wished they could go back and handle differently. And in turn, I found myself softening toward them, appreciating the sacrifices they had made, even if their decisions hadn't been perfect. At the same time, my relationship with Michael continued to grow. He didn't try to replace my parents, and I didn't expect him to. Instead, he became a new thread in the fabric of my life, a connection to my past that I hadn't realized I was missing. Michael had a way of filling in the gaps, offering pieces of my story that my parents couldn't provide. He told me about his childhood, his family, and even his dreams when he was younger. He shared stories about my mom from when they were together, painting a picture of her as a young woman I'd never known. "I wasn't ready to be a father," he said during one of our conversations. "But that doesn't mean I didn't care. I thought stepping back was the best thing I could do for you at the time. I see now how much I missed because of that decision," Hearing his perspective helped me understand his choices, even if I didn't fully agree with them. It was clear that he had carried the weight of his absence for years, and now, he was doing everything he could to make up for lost time. As I spent more time with Michael, I began to see the ways he and my dad had shaped different parts of who I was. Michael had passed on certain traits, my love for art, my tendency to overthink, but my dad had instilled the values that grounded me. They were both important pieces of my identity, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I had to choose between them. The process of forgiveness wasn't linear. There were days when the hurt resurfaced, when I felt like the secrets of the past were too much to move past. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I saw my parents not as infallible figures, but as humans who had done their best in a complicated situation. And through it all, I discovered something unexpected: growth. The pain of the past had forced us to confront truths we'd been avoiding for years, and in doing so, it had brought us closer. My parents, Michael, and I were finding a way to coexist, not perfectly, but with honesty and love. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't have all the answers, and I didn't know exactly what the future would look like. But I knew I was surrounded by people who cared about me, people who were willing to put in the work to make our relationship stronger. And in that, I found hope. When I first stumbled upon the hidden safe in my parents' attic, I had no idea how much it would change my life. It felt like an ordinary day, a task I had taken on without much thought. But that moment, kneeling on the dusty floor, staring at the old metal box, became a turning point in my life, a doorway to truths I hadn't even known I was searching for. The journey that followed was messy, emotional, and at times, overwhelming. It was a whirlwind of discovery, betrayal, forgiveness, and growth. What started as a shocking revelation about my biological father became so much more. It became a story of understanding who I was, where I came from, and how to reconcile the complicated relationships that shaped me. As the weeks turned into months, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd learned. My parents had built a life for me, a stable, loving foundation that I would always be grateful for. They had raised me with care, teaching me the values that defined who I was. Even though their choice to hide the truth about my adoption had caused pain, I could see now that it came from a place of love. My relationship with Michael continued to evolve. We weren't father and child in the traditional sense, and I didn't expect him to fill that role. But he became a part of my life in his own way, offering stories and perspectives that helped me understand parts of myself I hadn't fully appreciated before. His presence didn't diminish the bond one had with my parents. It added another layer to my identity. I also began to understand that family isn't about fitting people into rigid roles or labels. It's not about choosing one connection over another. Instead, it's about embracing the complexity of relationships and allowing space for everyone to coexist, even when it's messy. My parents, Michael, and I all had our own histories, our own regrets and hopes, but together, we were finding a way forward. There were moments when the journey felt heavy, when old wounds resurfaced, or when I doubted if we could ever fully heal from the secrets of the past. But there were also moments of lightness, of joy, when I saw how far we had come. Watching my parents laugh with Michael during a shared dinner, or hearing my mom and Michael reminisce about their younger days reminded me that growth and forgiveness were possible, even in the most unexpected circumstances. One day, as I sat with Michael on a park bench, he said something that stayed with me. "I missed so much," he admitted, staring at the ground. "But seeing you now, hearing about your life, it's clear to me that you turned out exactly how you were meant to. Your parents gave you that, and I'm so thankful for it." His words weren't just an acknowledgement of the past. They were a reminder of the present. I wasn't defined by the secrets or the choices that had been made before I was old enough to understand them. I was shaped by the love and effort of the people who had cared for me, and by my own decisions to grow and move forward. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced before. The pain of discovering the hidden safe, the shock of learning about Michael, and the anger I'd felt toward my parents, all of it had led me to a place of understanding. I had learned the importance of truth, not just for its own sake, but for the way it allows relationships to grow and deepen. I knew there would still be challenges ahead. Relationships are never perfect, and the road to healing isn't always linear. But I felt ready to face whatever came next, knowing that I was surrounded by people who cared about me, who were willing to do the work to grow together. Discovering the safe had turned my world upside down, but it had also given me something priceless: the chance to see my family for who they truly were, not just as parents or a biological connection, but as people trying their best in a complicated world. In the end, I realized that family isn't about blood or the roles we play. It's about love, forgiveness, and the willingness to keep showing up, even when it's hard. It's about embracing the messiness of life and finding strength in the connections that matter most. As I closed the chapter on this part of my journey, I felt a sense of peace. My family wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And with all its complexities and imperfections, it was enough. For the first time in a long time, I felt ready to embrace the future, not as a continuation of the past, but as a new beginning filled with possibilities.